Okay, well, good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know everybody's super busy with what's happening right now, and it's a pretty stressful time for everyone. I'm sorry, I'm Kamala Keeley. I'm president of the Chemung Chamber. Welcome for coming. Thank you, Jeff Boyce and Howard Garrity from the Small Business Administration for joining us. They are our local regional Small Business Administration assistants, so we are very happy to have them here with us to go over the new relief package that has been put out. I want to stress that I know this is a difficult time for businesses and individuals everywhere, and just to remind you that the Chamber of Commerce is here for all businesses. That's why we opened this seminar up to members and non-members alike. We are dedicated to the economic recovery of our region, and we're going to do everything we can to get us there once we get through this crisis and on to the road to that recovery. How the seminar is going to work this morning is Jeff and Howard are going to go through the slides. I think mostly Jeff, and Howard's here for support. They're going to go through the slides, and then we'll leave the rest open to question and answer. If you could use the chat to enter your questions and include your name, that would be wonderful. And then we will have my colleague, Emily Hoffman, will go through the questions at the end of the presentation, and we'll make sure we get through all of those. Just so you know, too, this is going to be recorded, so people will be able to view this after the fact, attendees and non-attendees alike. So we'll have this posted on the website, and we will send it also to attendees so that you have it as a resource. And with that, I'm going to say, Jeff, we'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much.
Great. Well, Kamala and Emily, thank you so much for organizing today's session. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Sorry.
Okay, so, folks, good morning. I'm Jeffrey Boyce. I'm the Upstate New York Branch Manager with the U.S. Small Business Administration. And as Kamala said, joined by my partner, Howard Garrity. Howard is our Economic Development Specialist located in our Elmira office. So he is your closest contact for all things SBA. I thought I'd just kind of set the stage this morning because I know government can be kind of confusing to folks. Just to remind people, so the SBA is a federal government agency created in 1953 to help Americans start, build, and grow their business. And we really do two basic things. We provide financial assistance and we provide technical assistance. You can kind of think of that as two buckets. And so the financial assistance is primarily loans, and those fit into a couple of broad categories, generally financing for fixed assets. So programs like 7A and 504 you might be familiar with, but also working capital loans, and we'll talk some more about those. And then importantly, the other area is technical assistance. And we do that really through a network of really key resource partners. First and foremost, the SBDC, the Small Business Development Centers, also other groups like SCORE and the Women's Business Centers and the Veterans Business Outreach Centers. So that's who we are. Today, we're going to talk about financial assistance for businesses impacted by the coronavirus, primarily two programs, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan and the new P3, the Paycheck Protection Program. So we'll go through some slides, provide some information, and then have time for questions and answers. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so let's start with the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. This is not a new program, right? So this is often referred to as the EIDL loan program, and this is something that SBA has had and offered for many years, but it's traditionally used differently, right? So EIDL loans, disaster loans, typically come into play for natural disasters. So there's a flood, there's a hurricane, there's a tornado. The damage is typically localized. It's in a certain area, and there's a process that we go through to have a disaster area declared, and then that enables us to go in and offer EIDL loans in that area. This is different, right? So the coronavirus, as we know, the impacts are broad and pervasive. So first of all, using this loan program to help businesses impacted by a pandemic has never been done before, so it's unique. And the ability to participate in this is ubiquitous. It's statewide, and I think at this point, every state in the country has been declared impacted by this disaster. So as you know, all businesses and nonprofits are eligible to apply for this program, small businesses anywhere in New York State. So the eligibility is broad, it's wide, and it enables folks to basically tap this program to get working capital to support their business and help them through the impacts of this disaster. Next slide, please. So just to drill into eligibility a little bit more, so again, small business using our typical SBA size standards with less than 500 employees, so that's pretty big. The state of New York talks about small business as 100 or fewer, but for us it's 500 or fewer. But importantly, also sole proprietors, independent contractors, and self-employed persons. They're also part of that definition of small business. And also private nonprofit organizations, so primarily 501c3s, but also some other kind of more specific entities. So you see here veterans organizations, but also small agricultural cooperatives and small businesses engaged in aquaculture. They can also apply. And importantly, based upon some clarification that came out just a few days ago, faith-based organizations, for the first time ever, can apply for these economic injury disaster loans. So that's a big change. That's a whole group of nonprofit organizations that just within the past few days has been deemed eligible by our administrator to apply for an EIDL loan, an economic injury disaster loan. Next slide. So as broad as that eligibility is, there are a few ineligible business types, and I've tried to kind of pick them out here for you in bold. And so importantly, unfortunately, farms, so businesses for whom agriculture, growing crops is their primary focus, those businesses are not eligible. Similarly, government entities, so state, local, municipal governments, while they're not-for-profits, government entities cannot apply. Also, businesses engaged in lobbying and businesses engaged in gambling, so casinos, that type of thing. In terms of lobbying, trade associations, chambers of commerce, unfortunately, are not eligible to participate in this program. So all small businesses and not-for-profits are, but a few caveats here, a few that are not eligible. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned this is a loan, right? So this is a loan, so the loan has to have terms, and you see them here. So businesses and not-for-profits can borrow up to $2 million. The maximum term for the loan is 30 years. It can be less, but these can be long-term working capital loans. You see the interest rates there. It's a percentage point less for not-for-profits. So these are low interest, long-term loans. And importantly, for this disaster, principal and interest payments are deferred, automatically deferred for 12 months. So you're impacted by this, you need some money to get through it, you can apply for one of these loans, and you do not have to make any payments for a year. Yes, interest continues to accrue, but the payments are deferred for a year. And the way to tap these loans is right through our website. You apply directly to the SBA through the SBA website. These are funds that we have access to from the U.S. Treasury, so we make these loans to folks who qualify. Importantly, collateral is only required for amounts borrowed of $200,000 or more. So for smaller loans, there is no collateral requirement, and that's different. Typically, that threshold is much lower, but it's been raised for this disaster. In terms of collateral, typically they look for real estate or sort of the best available fixed assets that could be pledged to support the loan. Okay, next slide. So here is really the most important new feature that I want to stress. So these EIDL loans, we've had for a while. It's an existing thing. We tweaked some of the parameters, but here's what's new. They also added this extra component just in the past week or so for eligible entities to apply and to seek this emergency advance. And really what it is in a nutshell is an ability to get a $10,000 quick disbursement that you apply for through the EIDL loan application, but it's really separate because this is a grant. These funds do not have to be dispersed. You basically, as you go through the EIDL loan application, towards the end, there's a box or an option you can check to seek these funds, and you do just that. I'll also mention as part of the sort of restructuring of this whole process, if you've gone through this, you certainly have appreciated the loan application itself has been dramatically streamlined and simplified. It's a completely online process. We say it takes 30 minutes, but you could probably do it in 5 or 10 minutes. It's a very streamlined process. And the way to tap this emergency advance is by applying for an EIDL loan. These are grant funds. They're dispersed electronically within a few days. I can't give you an exact number, but the intent is to disperse these quickly. And we're hoping that some of the first monies are going out right now as we speak. So I want to stress, this is new. This is an important benefit. And if you or your businesses are eligible, I strongly encourage you to take advantage of it. Next slide. Okay, so here's the second big program we want to talk about this morning, and this is also new. So the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, PPP, has all those different names. This is a brand new SBA program that comes from the $2 trillion stimulus package. And just kind of in a nutshell, what it is kind of a new specialized version of our 7A loan program. It is designed to provide businesses and not-for-profits with compensation to enable them to maintain their payroll for about 8 weeks. In a nutshell, that's the vision of this program, is to use the 7A loan process and our lenders as a conduit to efficiently disperse these funds to basically keep businesses functioning and paying their employees over the next 8 weeks, so that when this disaster begins to subside, businesses continue to be viable and can quickly resume their operations. So again, this is designed to be a forgivable loan if you meet these two broad requirements, one of which is to use the monies for eligible costs, payroll costs, and we'll talk more about that. And secondly, that you keep or you quickly reestablish and maintain your employment levels, your FTEs. Next slide. Okay, so again, who can apply? So very similar here. So again, it's small businesses, and we're talking about, again, using our side standards, so 500 or fewer employees. But again, importantly, sole proprietors, independent contractors, and folks that are self-employed, they can also tap this source of funding and support as well. Similarly, again, we've got the private nonprofit organizations, including the faith-based organizations and those other special groups. They're also eligible for this. And I'm pleased to say that farmers can apply for this, the P3 program. So that's important. This is a program for which they are not excluded, and they can participate. It says here applicants have to be in operation since February 15 of 2020. So if you're a startup, unfortunately, this isn't for you. If your business has literally just launched or is launching now, this is not the program for you. This is for existing businesses. But again, most business types are eligible. Next slide.
Right. We just have to compare it to our inventory system.
I'm sorry.
So,
is there a question?
That's,
Can we hold the questions to the end and then we can just kind of go through them? Thank you. Okay, so when can I apply? The short answer is now, right? So this program literally just began and launched last Friday. So we're in what? Business day 3 of folks being able to apply. The way it's structured is it's kind of a phased application approach. So last Friday, as you see here, small businesses and sole proprietors could begin to apply, and then a slight phasing this Friday, those independent contractors and self-employed individuals can also begin to apply. So this program will run until June 30th or until the funds are exhausted. I don't think we're going to run out of money in a matter of days, but I'm sure we will at some point. So the best advice is to take the most immediate action you can to apply for these funds. Next slide. Okay, so you know what it is, you know when you can apply, how do you apply? Pretty straightforward and different from the EIDL loan that I talked about in the beginning. So EIDL loan, you go to the SBA website, those are our monies, you apply through us, we make those loans. This program, P3, is different. You go to a bank. You go to an existing SBA 7A lender, of which we have lists. It's a very extensive list, and you work with the bank to complete and submit your application. You can find a list of lenders on the SBA website. Hopefully you as a business owner have a business relationship with a bank or a credit union, and hopefully they participate in this program. Most do, many do, but there's also the provision for additional financial institutions to opt in, and there's a process they can go through to do that. So we expect the list will grow over time. The application itself for P3 is also pretty simple, pretty straightforward. There's a sample posted on the SBA website, which you can look at and download. It's, again, substantially a one-page application. You use that plus your payroll records to go and work with a lender to apply for these funds. There's no credit elsewhere test, so you don't have to prove that you have no other access to funding. And similarly, there's no scoring that's done as part of the application. It's really pretty streamlined and pretty straightforward. Next slide. So again, this is a loan that's intended to be forgivable and turn into a grant, but it is a loan, so we have some terms. The interest rate is 1%, so it's super low cost. Again, all payments are deferred automatically for 6 months, and the maximum loan term is 2 years. And that's, again, because this is really meant to be a quick disbursement that becomes forgivable. But if you don't meet the terms, the balance or some portion of it could still be a loan that you'd have to repay. As you see, there's no prepayment penalties, there's no loan fees, there's no collateral, there's no personal guarantee, and the maximum amount is $10 million. So those are the terms. The way the loan amount is calculated, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is it takes a look at your payroll costs, which are substantially your gross wages for the business, a monthly average of those, plus some other costs, so like rent, utilities, and mortgage interest, and you multiply those by a factor of 2.5, and then that produces the maximum loan amount. So that's basically how the calculations are done. Next slide. Okay, so Jeff, you said this is a forgivable loan, so are you serious? Are you sure? Yes. If you meet these criteria, right? So you basically have to take the loan proceeds and expend them in an allowable way, which is to pay for those payroll costs and a few of those other costs we'll talk about. And 75% of the loan amount has to go to pay for those payroll expenses. Again, the goal, the objective of this program is for businesses to keep paying their employees, their workers, so that they can pay their bills so the economy functions best it can, and we're ready to go once the shutdown is over. So that's criteria number one. Number two, you've got to substantially maintain your staffing levels. So they'll look at your FTE count prior to this impact of the disaster, and then at the end of 8 weeks, and you've got to maintain or quickly reestablish your headcount. Those are the two requirements to be able to have this amount forgiven. If you don't meet those, if you substantially but don't completely meet that two-prong test, there are some calculations they go through to allow some but not all of the amount to be forgiven. So it's not all or nothing, but this is the way you get the total amount forgiven. Next slide, please. Okay, so payroll costs, here you see kind of a breakdown. So again, it's substantially salary and wages and commission and tips. Worker salaries are capped at $100,000. So if they make more, that's great, but you're only counting the first $100,000 of an employee's salary. And also as part of payroll costs are benefits, which we know can be a huge expense for businesses. So think about all the healthcare costs and vacation and leave costs. All of that factors into what's considered payroll. So it's essentially your gross wages plus those benefit costs. That's what goes into calculating your payroll costs. I mentioned too that in addition, you can include rent and utilities and mortgage interest. So utilities are like gas and electric and telephone and internet. those types of costs. Again, a monthly average of those plus your monthly average payroll cost times 2.5. That becomes your loan amount. Finally, I guess I'll say, an obvious question. Can you apply for both? Can you get an economic injury disaster loan, especially that emergency cash advance and a P3? And the answer is yes. And my advice is yes, you should apply for both programs. The only caveat is that you cannot use the proceeds from the two programs to cover the exact same costs. So if you think about P3, the focus of that really is to cover payroll. So if you got that EIDL loan emergency grant, you would want to use that $10,000 for some other costs, non-payroll costs, or to use them in the future for additional payroll costs above and beyond the 8-week period. So that's just an important thing to remember kind of going into this, is that the monies that you might receive from both programs cannot be used to pay the exact same cost. But you can, and frankly, you should apply for both and try to maximize, any and all benefits that you're eligible for under both programs. So with that, I'm going to pause. That was a lot of information, and we'll do our best to answer questions. As I said to Emily and to Kamala setting this up, there are lots of very specific questions we're beginning to get now that are kind of situationally specific. Some of them we got to kind of take offline and drill into them. And with all of them, we do our best to answer them based upon the best available information that we have. And frankly, additional information is coming out on some of the nuances of this stuff really every day. So we'll do our best to answer your questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Jeff. This is Emily with the Chamber. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So we'll now move into the Q&A portion of today's webinar. To facilitate the Q&A, we will go in order of questions asked in the chat room. To view the chat room, just make sure the speech bubble icon in the lower toolbar is blue. That means it's turned on and you can see the chat room. Please remember to include your name along with your question. And you are welcome to chime in during your question as needed. Just remember to turn your microphone on when you are speaking and off while others are speaking. Okay, so let's look at some questions here. Okay, so our first question from a member business. The Massachusetts SBA field office recently put out an FAQ that stated, EIDL loans advances will start to be distributed this week, $1,000 per employee, up to $10,000 max. Is this the case? The other big question is, when will they start awarding the EIDL advance and the PPP?
Yeah, so those are great questions. I mean, I can tell you that, from the perspective of our Syracuse district office, the approach that Howard and I and all of our colleagues take is we're only posting and disseminating official information that, that we're getting, frankly, from headquarters and that we're seeing come through officially. So I can't comment on how other districts are approaching this, but to answer the questions, yes, I know that the intent of these EIDL loan emergency advances is to disperse them in a few days. I think the eventual goal, as all of these systems get sort of implemented and optimized, is to do that maybe in as few as 3 days. And I can only share with you what I've heard. So what I've heard is that all of the applications that came in last week, are basically in process right now. So even if you applied on Monday and you didn't get your money on Friday, that's 3 days. What happened? The answer is you probably should see that, I would think, certainly this week, today, tomorrow. My sense is that now that they're moving to processing that first wave, those funds are and will be distributed, in the next few days. That's the goal. Now to the amount, yes, I have also heard that is an approach that will be taken. So if you read carefully all the materials, it says that you're eligible for this emergency advance of up to $10,000. That suggests that you could receive an amount that's less. And yes, I have heard that an approach that they'll take is to use the headcount, and for those companies with 10 or more employees, they might get the full amount, but that for those with fewer, there might be this $1,000 per employee. I don't have that concrete, but I've heard that same thing, and I think that's a likely approach that will be taken as a way to try to distribute this, kind of in a more equitable fashion. So if you're bigger, you'd get more, essentially.
Okay, thank you. So our next question from Lisa Gill. How long do we have to maintain employment levels to qualify for loan forgiveness? If in 12 months we find that we need to make employment changes, is our loan forgiveness at risk?
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe there's a period that far in advance they'd be looking at. And again, the intent is that you maintain that headcount during the 8 weeks for which you're receiving and expending the funds. I'm not aware of an obligation to maintain a headcount beyond that. I mean, that's really the focus of this program, is to understand what your monthly costs were for payroll and those other things I mentioned prior to this disaster, to look at that amount and to basically disseminate to businesses those funds and say to them, now go spend them over the next 8 weeks. Keep all of your employees on the payroll. Keep paying them at substantially the same amount, providing their benefits. And then after you've completed that, you go back again to the lender and you basically attest to the fact that you did those things. You probably would provide some more payroll documents to substantiate that. And based upon your, demonstration that you've achieved that and their sort of good faith attempt to verify that, the loan would then be forgiven. That's really the focus, the intent. I don't believe there's any requirement, many weeks or months into the future that you'd maintain those same levels. The focus is really on 8 weeks, on 2 months, to kind of get us through this pause.
Thanks, Jeff. So our next question is from Joelle, and her question is, how does this tie in with businesses that are non-essential?
I really don't think there's any connection, right? So there's a whole separate sort of designation or process that's been undertaken, primarily here at the state level by the governor's office and Empire State Development, to think about those types of businesses that are deemed essential and can continue operating. That's really separate and at the state level, and it's separate from this federal assistance. And so I think it kind of gets to the question of, well, if I receive these monies, is there an assumption that my business is open and operating? And the answer is no, right? So you might receive the monies and keep paying people even though they're not working or they're doing different or substantially less things. I mean, you sort of make a business decision as to what people are able to do, probably substantially from a remote, position. But there's no connection between those two, and there's no expectation that you would get the monies and then violate the requirements to remain shut down. Again, the goal is that you pay people. What they do or don't do as they're being paid is really sort of unique and up to the business and the employees.
So a lot of my business owners have that concern exactly, that they receive these funds in hopes that they're going to be forgiven when they can apply for forgiveness, but are unsure if they're going to be able to retain employees after that 8 weeks. If we're still in this pause, if we haven't come to a point where they can open their doors and continue to make money and then pay those employees on their own, it's a concern that it's not going to be forgiven because they weren't able or allowed to maintain the requirements.
Yeah, and that's why I say, again, the focus is on those 8 weeks. I mean, frankly, just as you said, what happens beyond that really is anyone's guess at this point. We just don't know how quickly things will begin to return to a more normal state, and I think we would all recognize it will likely be sort of a phased return to normalcy, and that might continue, I think would likely continue to have consequences for businesses and employment and cash flow and all that. So the focus is really on that time period and sort of what happens beyond that, and if there are additional sources of assistance made available, or, I just don't know. But again, just to go back, the intent is to expend those dollars for an 8-week period and to maintain or quickly reestablish your headcount. If you receive the funds and if you spend them in the appropriate ways, and if you maintain or reestablish the headcount, you are then in compliance with the requirements of the program. You would then return to the lender at the conclusion of that time period, provide that proof and those attestations, fill out probably another simple form, and based upon that, the lender would be authorized and empowered to forgive the loan. That's how that process is designed to work.
Thank you.
The next question is, can you get the $10,000 grant and limit your loan to the $10,000 if you don't need any additional funds or don't want to borrow yet?
Yes, that's a question that, I hear coming up quite often. And so you do not have to be borrowing additional monies through the more traditional economic injury disaster loan to receive that $10,000 emergency disbursement. You can, but you do not have to. And I think probably for many smaller businesses, they might not need to, or they just might not know at this point. So, you go through that process, you provide, again, very basic information about your business and revenues and cost of goods sold, and you're basically attesting to the fact that your business has been adversely impacted by the virus and the economic shutdown. And by providing that, you're demonstrating that you're eligible for that $10,000 disbursement, but you're not obligated or committing to borrow any additional amount. And even if you were offered additional funding structured as a traditional EIDL loan, you would be under no obligation to take it. So that's why we say to folks, you have nothing to lose. Really the best advice is to fill out that quick application, check that box at the end for the emergency disbursement, and take advantage of those funds.
Great. So moving on, Diane had a question. We applied for the disaster loan on the 31st. I have a confirmation number, but to date, we have not received an email confirmation or any other information. Is that unusual or usual?
So, the traditional economic injury disaster loan, there's a whole process. The previous application was much more extensive in terms of the information the applicant provided. That then necessitated, as you might expect, a much more in-depth review, assignment to a loan officer, a review for completeness, maybe a request for supplemental information, and then some discussion back and forth that would result in some offer of an amount in terms, right? Which could be less than 30 years. It could be, whatever dollar amount was sort of mutually deemed to be appropriate. That process takes time. So under the sort of the old way of doing things, that would typically take a few weeks. Again, once it was complete, and then there'd be some kind of an offer, there'd be preparation of closing documents sent back to the borrower that had to be signed, and then a closing and disbursement. That whole process under the previous sort of scenario could easily take 30 or 45 days. I haven't seen yet how this will work given the streamlined application. My sense is that for businesses that are also seeking to borrow funding through the EIDL loan process, separate from just the 10K quick disbursement, my sense is that the same type of thing would happen. It would get assigned to a loan officer. That person would contact the borrower, would certainly have to request more detailed information, financial statements, that sort of thing, tax returns. There'd be some back and forth. And I think for folks that have applied and haven't heard yet, it's because of that aspect of the redesign program is being worked out. But I would still expect that to take some time, that it would not be realistic to think about borrowing as much as $2 million based upon that existing quick application. So even if you submitted all of that a week or so ago, I guess I'm not surprised to hear that that process hasn't concluded yet. And the fact that you have a loan number or some evidence that your application was successfully received, that's important. You may want to give it a little more time, but one suggestion that I can make is that you can call there's an 800 number for the loan processing, which is all done centrally. So Howard and I don't have access to your loan application. We cannot see into the system for obvious confidentiality reasons and for efficiency. That's all handled and processed by SBA employees centrally. There is a number you can call to inquire on the status, and I can give you that. So it's 800-659-2955. So again, 800-659-2955. That should enable you to connect with somebody who could then take that number, look into the system, and determine the status. Again, I would just mention, as you can imagine, they're getting lots of phone calls. Strategy tip, you might want to call early or late in the day to try to avoid some of the volume traffic.
Thank you, Jeff. And just a reminder to everyone that when we get to your question, if you do want to chime in with any clarifying questions, please feel free. So the next question is from Kamala. The question is, if a business currently isn't at their full capacity of staffing due to temporary layoffs, like a restaurant, when is the best time to apply for the PPP? Before the June 30th deadline, and also once they bring back full staff, so it is 8 weeks from that point, or should they apply immediately even though they are not at full staff?
I would say apply immediately, right? Because for a number of reasons. Number one, the current funding is finite, right? So there's an allocation. It's huge. It's $349 billion. But, at some point, way before June 30th, that is likely to be exhausted. So I think it's, wise to apply now. Start by reaching out to whoever your business banker or credit union is. Hopefully you have a relationship with a loan officer or a branch that you work with. Reach out to them and express interest in the program and begin that conversation. And I would do that now because, again, if you're a restaurant or if you're in hospitality, tourism, that type of business where you literally cannot function, that's okay because you want to get these monies and be able to continue paying your employees or put them back on the payroll if they dropped off and filed unemployment and pay them and enable them to draw their benefits for at least the next 8 weeks. That's what the intent of this program is. Even if your business is not able to open and they're not able to physically come back and do the traditional things they would do at a hotel, in a restaurant, the intent is that you keep paying them, again, so that they can pay their bills, and it minimizes the economic impact that we would all feel.
Okay, the next question is from Amy. If a business is non-essential and has laid employees off since they are forced to close, are they eligible for the PPP if they have not rehired employees? If the employee is receiving unemployment, how does that work so they don't, quote unquote, double dip?
Yeah, great question. It's kind of a continuation of what we just talked about. So yes, they're eligible, right? As long as they meet the parameters, the size standards, and one of the eligible entity types. they should apply. They should tap this funding and let it flow to their employees. Now, if the employees, to date or in the meantime, have been furloughed, have been fired, whatever, and they are now drawing unemployment, certainly is understandable. Lots of folks are doing that, but it would not be appropriate for them to sort of double dip. It would be inconsistent for them to be brought back on the payroll and receiving their normal paycheck from the employer and still be drawing unemployment. So in that instance, the employees would have to stop receiving unemployment to then begin receiving and reestablishing their normal paycheck, at least for the next 8 weeks. And again, what happens beyond that, I don't think anyone really knows at this point, but they could not do both. I would also add that, so another question that we sometimes get is, do I have to rehire the exact same employees? The answer is no. The focus is on the headcount, not who the people are. The hope is that you would rehire most or many of the same people, and I just think that's logical. Those are your employees. You want them to come back. But if for whatever personal reasons or circumstances an employee has moved or doesn't want to come back, that's okay, but your goal would then be to fill that position again, so that, or a similar position, so that your head count is substantially the same.
Okay, next is a question from Nancy. Her question is, how can we meet both of these conditions? A borrower is eligible for loan forgiveness equal to the amount the borrower spent on the following items during the 8-week period beginning on the date of the origination of the loan, or businesses have until June 30th, 2020 to rehire employees and restore salaries.
Yeah, so again, it's a two-pronged test to have the loan forgiven. You've got to spend the monies on those allowable costs. When we talked about those, it's substantially payroll, and then the rent, utilities, mortgage, excuse me. And then in addition, you've got to maintain or reestablish your headcount. So you've got to do both. And the thinking is that by doing one, it enables you to do the other, right? So if the amount of the loan you've been given is based upon your average monthly payroll costs, and you then take those monies and spend them on payroll for 8 weeks, the reasoning is that then enables you to maintain your headcount, because you got the money to cover what it used to cost to employ that many people. So those things should work together well. And again, 75% of the loan has to be spent on payroll, and that's recognizing that there are those other costs that can factor in, like rent, utilities, mortgage, that sort of thing. And so, but the goal is that the majority of the funding goes to pay people and their benefits, not to pay sort of other related business operating costs. Some can go for that, but the majority, 75%, has to go to pay the payroll. And so again, that's the thinking. If you receive those monies and you expend them in that allowable way, you will be able to maintain or reestablish the headcount, you meet the two-pronged test, and the loan becomes forgivable and is a grant.
Thank you. Next question is, does the $10,000 from the EIDL then reduce your forgiveness value?
That's a great question. So yes, you can apply for both, but with some caveats. So the one I said before is that you can't use the monies for the exact same thing, but this is another important point. Yes, if you receive an economic injury disaster loan, EIDL loan emergency advance, which is a grant of some amount up to $10,000, that gets netted out of any Paycheck Protection Program P3 loan that gets forgiven and becomes a grant. And the thinking is that if you already received some cash benefits in one program, it would be netted out of what's likely going to be a much larger cash benefit you'd receive from another program. Because remember, the amount you can borrow through EIDL is $2 million. The maximum of this emergency disbursement is $10,000. But under the P3 program, the maximum amount of the forgivable loan is $10 million. So the thinking is that you will likely receive a much larger benefit there that would be completely forgiven. And so any amount of that EIDL emergency disbursement would be netted out of the P3 loan amount that is forgiven. Yes, great question.
Okay, the next question from Marty. If you've already applied for the EIDL and have an application number from SBA and did not previously check the EIDL emergency advance loan initially, can you still apply for the emergency EIDL loan?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, just to kind of relive the excitement that has been the past 2 weeks, right? So when the disaster assistance sort of first launched, you know, SBA turned to an existing tool in our toolbox, which was the EIDL loan, and we said, okay, we're going to enable governors to declare the entire state a disaster zone, and we're going to consider the coronavirus as a disaster, not unlike a tornado. That was administratively some things that we did quickly to begin helping businesses. And so we began to take applications from businesses using our previous systems back about 2 weeks ago. And at the very beginning, there was not a streamlined application, nor was there this option to get this emergency advance of up to $10,000. So some businesses that were very proactive and quick to take advantage of that good opportunity filed an application under the old system. To their credit, they provided, you know, much more substantial information and didn't have the option to check that emergency disbursement. So for any of those firms, unfortunately, yes, they would have to reapply. They should reapply, but it is, like I said before, a really, really dramatically streamlined and simplified application that they, you know, given all the information they've already gathered, can probably do in 5 or 10 minutes. And by going through that revised application, they can click that button for that disbursement of up to $10,000. And my hope and belief is that our systems would be able to reconcile their old application and the new one. And again, if they were seeking to borrow some larger amount through the traditional EIDL program, they would have already provided much more extensive information. So it should not be lost effort, because a loan officer is going to want that anyway. So it's really kind of belt and suspenders. They would also resubmit a second streamlined application, but that would be the way to tap that $10,000 disbursement. But yes, that is what they should do.
Okay, the next question is from Penny. There is a two-part question here. So I applied for the EIDL loan, but do not recall seeing a location to enter a requested amount. Did I miss something? And also, I applied for PPP, and the bank specifically advised me that I could not include any monies other than payroll. So the application has gone in simply with payroll calculated. Should I get in touch with the bank regarding this?
All right, so let's take the first one first. So the way the EIDL loan process works, and certainly my colleague Howard is much more familiar than I am. He's got many, many years of service with the SBA, so I invite him to chime in too. But my understanding is that the way it works is that you, as the applicant, you provide all of this information that's required, pretty extensive financials on the business, tax returns, and based upon that information, which becomes a completed application, a loan officer, through some back and forth with the business, would determine the amount of funding to be offered to deal with the disaster and its impact on the business and the term of the loan. So it's kind of specific to each borrower in terms of how much they would get and how long they'd have to repay it. And that would come out through the back and forth with the loan officer. It isn't a matter of sort of plugging that in on the application and then just getting a yes or a no. Howard, anything to add on that? Silence might mean no, or the mute button is battling him. So the other part was on the P3 program and including costs beyond payroll. I mean, you could go back to the borrower and amend that or not. I guess the question would be, how big of a deal do you think it is? Like, how much more might you have been able to include if you put into the amount, like I said, rent, utilities, mortgage, interest payments? You know, for some businesses, I suppose those could be very substantial and might enable them to qualify for a much larger loan, again, that could be forgiven. So I think it's really kind of up to the applicant and their financial institution to work through that. I will mention, as it relates to calculating payroll costs, there was some excellent guidance just posted last night on the U.S. Treasury website. It's a pretty extensive FAQ that drills into some examples and much more detailed information on how to calculate payroll, quote unquote. There had been, I think, a little bit of ambiguity on that, and so some really good guidance was just posted there last night. So again, that's treasury.gov. Just like on the SBA site, there's a really prominent banner that you can click on for information on programs to help with the coronavirus impact. And you'll see Treasury has also, like the SBA, some really excellent information and resources. It's substantially similar, but in this case, there is a bit of more detailed and even more current information as it relates to calculating payroll costs.
Okay. So I think the next question here might be related. It says, banks are using different calculations than accountants are for payroll costs. Why is this not more clear and defined? Do the banks get the final say?
So that's exactly it. And I think it's important to drill a little deeper on this. So you think of how this all kind of cascades down. This is kind of a government lesson, right? So first, Congress, the legislative branch, crafts legislation, in this case for a new program, and authorizes funding. And the president signs it. And that then enables different agencies to do things like create or modify their existing programs, in this case, the SBA. And then when it comes to the agency can further define that by crafting regulations to sort of fill in more details. And so the SBA has done that. So that's kind of the next level down. And then finally, agencies can issue administrative guidance, can be fact sheets, FAQs, examples, to even further clarify and provide information on how things should work. And that's exactly what we're in, right? So literally just a week ago, Congress passed legislation, President signed it. Then last week, our agency, the SBA, posted on an emergency basis the rules, the regulations for this program. And now we're seeing some additional administrative guidance being offered as the need sort of becomes apparent to give more clarity or direction. So, and again, it's sort of day by day because this is all so new and the need is so great and such urgency. So financial institutions could begin taking applications starting last Friday. And so they did that, and also yesterday on Monday. And they did that based upon the best available guidance, which was the legislation and the regulations. And while there was some instruction on what payroll costs included and how to calculate them, I think there was also as folks began to sort of drill into that, a need for a little more. And so that's why these FAQs came out literally just last night. And that, I believe, will give CPAs working with their businesses and businesses themselves then going to a bank a much more precise and consistent way to calculate those numbers. And I think you'll see that now kind of flowing through the systems this week as financial institutions continue to take these applications, which importantly include this payroll calculation, which can now be made more precisely based upon that guidance.
So, question to follow up on that. If we are bringing people back and they don't actually have work to do, wouldn't, I guess, the loan forgiveness amount is going to be based on similar criteria as the loan amount. So couldn't we put ourselves in jeopardy by not being able to collect all the costs and basically adding to our expenses and not being able to add to our revenue?
Yeah, so great question. So the requirement is that you continue to pay people or that you put them back on the payroll and start paying them again, period. Frankly, there's no requirement that they actually work, right? So what they can do, given the uniqueness of the business, is really kind of up to the business owner and management. A lot of folks can do work remotely, but not everyone. Some people physically have to be at their place of business. And as we talked about earlier, only a small number of business types have been deemed essential. So it may not be physically possible for people to work, but the intent is that they be paid, not that they work. If they can work, if there's some way for them to contribute, again, creatively, that's up to the employee and the business owner. There's lots of things people are doing. It's hard to do everything remotely, but plans for the future, contingency plans, maintenance, lots of different things that folks might be able to do while they take advantage of this pause, and that they could do and collaborate with others in a remote fashion. Those are the types of creative solutions people are coming up with, so as to both benefit the employee and, frankly, the business who would be compensating them. The business would derive some benefit from their labor, from their brainpower, even if they're not physically at a work location doing their normal, typical job.
Right, but like the FICA tax, I've seen some calculations where that's included, and then others where it's not. So if that's not included on an employee, that's almost 7% of tax that the business then has an expense, as if they weren't working, we wouldn't have that expense at all. So not knowing that clarification makes it a little bit difficult to make some of these decisions.
Yep, that's a great question. So take a look at that Treasury FAQ. I've only had a chance to skim it this morning before this call, but it gets into some of those situations just like you're raising. And they talk about, gross payroll. That's what they're looking at, is sort of those sort of top line gross numbers, not necessarily netting out or getting into the specifics of FICA, payroll taxes, that sort of thing. They're trying to look at round numbers for the basis of the calculation. So take a look at that. I think it will give you some better guidance on how they intend for these things to be calculated.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the time here. It's 5 after 11, and we do have a few more questions. Jeff, are you able to answer a few more?
Yes, I can give you about another 5 minutes, and then I've got to hop for another appointment, so sure.
Okay, thank you. For any questions that we don't get to, we will record the questions, and we will get back to everyone with some answers on those. So our next question from Karen was, can a person get the PPP if they do not have a business account with the bank already set up?
So that's a great question, and there was a lot of discussion yesterday as I returned calls to businesses in our community. dealing with, or sort of touching on like how to engage with financial institutions, right? So I said that the EIDL loan, you apply to SBA. It's a website, it's simple, but for the P3, you need to go through a lender, and it needs to be one of our 7A approved authorized lenders. The best scenario is that your business already has a business banking relationship with a lender and they're a 7A approved lender. That is the best scenario. It's not required, right? So you could go to any of the different approved lenders, and any of them theoretically should be able to take your application and process it. But here's sort of the practical nature of this. Given the volume, given that, again, go back to the eligibility, substantially every small business and nonprofit in the country is eligible for these funds, or some portion of them. The volume of interest and inquiry is, just massive. So what many financial institutions have been doing is at least initially prioritizing helping businesses with whom they already have a relationship. That's logical. It's not impermissible. And so that is an approach that I know many lenders are taking. So a strategy might be, to kind of shop around and try to find a lender that isn't experiencing such a volume crush, such that they're willing to work with you even if you don't have a business account now, because frankly, it represents an opportunity for a new customer, number one. Or number two, another approach might be to try to go to a bigger lender that has quickly built some digital capacities to handle a really big volume. Some of the bigger commercial banks have rapidly scaled up and built their own web interface to take and process these applications. That might also be a strategy. I'd encourage you to try both and to be persistent. Frankly, it's going to take, some time. So today, this morning, we're literally in day 3 of this process. And like I said, the interest and eligibility conceivably touches nearly every small business and nonprofit organization in the country. So it's just a massive wave of people who are trying to tap this, and it will take some time for all of those folks to sort of work their way through various systems and receive funding. And I think as each day goes by, just like we get more clarity on some of the details, similarly, these electronic systems are either dramatically improved or are significantly scaled up to handle much, much larger volumes. And that's exactly what it's going to take.
Thank you, Jeff. Should we just do one last question here?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay. So from Pam, her question is, I read that the EIDL can be used for accounts payable. If we have our carpet sanitized for health and safety, will that be allowable under this advance?
Yeah, I think so, right? I mean, so if you think about the intent of the EIDL loan and that emergency disbursement, it's meant to be for working capital that enables the business to continue and to deal with the impacts of the disaster. So it's pretty broad in terms of how that can be used. And I think in the situation you just described, that's entirely logical. There's been, all sorts of sort of redoubled efforts for deep cleaning and modifications to sort of normal, business practices to deal with the virus. Think of all the plexiglass shields in grocery stores and the tremendous sort of redoubling of, cleaning and sterilization and all of that. So those are logical things that a business could point to say these are operating costs that we've incurred or need to incur to deal with this, or to be ready to sort of get through this period and come out the other side able to function. So my sense is yes, that would be a very logical thing to include.
Okay, and there was a second part of her question. Pam, did you want us to ask that as well? I'll just put it out there real quick. Do I understand correctly that we could begin paying full regular schedule payroll effective Monday, April 13th through Friday, June 6th, an 8-week period? Would all other programs employees have been using, i.e. unemployment and paid family leave, then end for them on April 13th?
So this is on the P3 program. And so again, the way that works is you gather your information, you go to a lender, you apply, they take your stuff, they say, yep, it's complete, they submit your application. It is processed, which essentially means it electronically gets routed to SBA. There's some review and approval is then given back to the bank to disperse the funds and to structure it again as that short-term loan. Once that happens and you receive the funds, then you would need to, upon receipt of the funds, begin to expend them for that 8-week period. Now, there's nothing that would prohibit you from continuing to pay people or to incur those costs prior to that, but the window that you'd want to demonstrate compliance with is upon receipt of the funds. So after you got the P3 monies, then for a period of 8 weeks. That's sort of the look back or the snapshot that would be most important to have the loan forgiven. What you're doing prior to that and again after that are really separate. It's that 8-week period after receipt of the funds that you'd want to demonstrate that you got them and you used them in the appropriate way, and now the loan becomes a grant and is forgivable.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So just a final note to everyone that if your question if we did not have a chance to get to your question, that we will get back to you. And we truly thank everyone for their time today.
Emily, thanks to you, the Chamber, Kamala, all your colleagues, and to Howard, my colleague on the phone, and frankly for all of the folks that called in and are interested in trying their hardest to get the information, to do the right thing, to tap these programs. I appreciate your perseverance, and I just ask you to just keep on that same path. That's what's going to help us all get through this and hopefully come out of this in the shortest time period possible in the most successful way to get our businesses and our employees working into the future.
Thanks, Jeff. We appreciate your time.
Thanks. Take care, folks.